Alright guys, welcome back to the Improvement Podcast and hope everyone is well. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about ways to create novelty in your training. So in terms of why the episode, so when it comes to training in the gym, you don't always, or not everyone has access to a ton of equipment. As a result, there's not a lot of point, like if a movement stalls, swapping like a good exercise for a bad exercise. Meaning, I'd rather someone try and find some way to add in a bit of variation on, let's say, a barbell back squat, then swap to like maybe a different movement, like a goblet squat, which you don't really have much runway to progress. It's not a great movement if you have like a decent level of strength and experience. So basically, this episode's going to go over how you can create more runway for progression with your training, how you can continue to progress your lifts without just like staying stagnant with your training, because there's always going to be a point where a movement will stop progressing. You won't infinitely progress a movement. So some will obviously stall quicker than others, but like you won't always be able to add the same weight you did to a movement when you like first add it in. For example, a barbell back squat. If you manage to put like 5 kilograms on it per week, you won't be able to do that forever, or you'll be the world's strongest squatter, and maybe I'm not sure how long. I'm not going to do the maths, but I think you get the drift. It will eventually slow down and stop progressing. And I'd rather, like I said, see someone make some variation in regards to how they're performing the movement than just swapping it out all completely if they don't have another good alternative. So we can create novelty instead, which is basically making the exercise different in some sense. So just like how we'd make novelty by swapping a movement, we can do so just by changing the way we're doing it for whatever reason. And this is what I'd recommend you do if a movement stalls or stops progressing. And the reason being is we don't want to just do the same weight for the same reps, because we're not really going to get much out of it. We're not really going to get much out of it in terms of stimulus for muscle growth, because we need to be applying progressive overload. We need to be getting stronger over time for like a movement to have much value, to be honest, because like we need to force adaptation, and if we're not forcing adaptation, then I don't think we're going to get much out of that movement. So we want to basically make sure we're constantly providing our body with a novel stimulus, basically meaning like a stress it's never experienced before. And we can do so by just changing something, but instead of changing the exercise, we can change something in regards to execution. And a consideration to have is what I'm going to go over. Not all movements you should take the same approach with. And what I mean by that is some movements, the changes that I'm going to go over, will suit them more than other. For example, one of them is tempo I'm going to go over. And also, I'll get to that, but instead of tempo, I'll touch on range of motion. That's a better example. So with range of motion, sometimes to add in, let's say, some novelty when you're squatting, you could be like, right, I'm gonna reset this movement. I'm gonna try and use more range of motion, so it's novel, so it's new, so it's different than before, by, let's say, elevating my heels when I'm barbell back squatting. And that's a good example to stick with, because not a lot of people have, let's say, a hack squat or Smith machines, or well, most gyms do, but some don't anyway. And maybe they don't have alternatives for whatever reason. So what you could potentially do is, with like a barbell back squat, try and get more range of motion. However, when it comes to, let's say, a deadlift variation, it's probably not a good idea trying to get more range of motion if you can't do so while maintaining a neutral spine. So in that case, we shouldn't use the same, let's say, changes to create novelty. We should maybe do something else to create novelty with a deadlift, whereas it makes sense to do so when you are doing a barbell back squat. So here you see there's some different circumstances where you can get more range, and it's going to be an effective way of creating a novel stimulus by creating novelty, whereas some other circumstances it's not going to be a great way to create novelty, if that makes sense. So in terms of how we create novelty in our training, something we can do is simply resetting a movement. So what you find is when you do a movement week on week, month on month, as much as you try and keep your form the same, because we should keep our form standardized, which basically means the same while progressing load or reps, it does eventually slip. It sometimes does slip, no matter how hard we try not to, just because like a very, very small change week on week can add up, and just unconsciously we're making it a bit easier. So execution can slip, even if we like try and make it stay in a good spot. just due to chasing progression. So something we can do is just reset the movement. So strip some weight off, get better range of motion, or have greater control, and kind of like have a fresh start with it. So if you notice, right, a movement's not progressing, you look at your form, your lowering phase is really fast, you are maybe not controlling as much as you like, maybe your hips are shooting up during a squat, or something's off, something doesn't look good in terms of your execution. You could just dial it back and, let's say, control the loading phase more and try and then progress it again, take some weight off, nail the form, and then work it back up. So you're not actually making a change, you're just kind of tidying up the execution you're supposed to be having, if that makes sense. And something else you can do is, again, increase range of motion. That's typically going to be valuable when it comes to muscle growth anyway. So if you feel like, right, this movement's stalling, it's not progressing, I can I've been stuck on a certain weight for certain reps for about 3 weeks, which is kind of like the amount of time I recommend having before changing something. If you've been nailing your nutrition and your sleep, then if you've done that for 3 weeks, and what I'd say is maybe try and increase your range of motion. Could you go deeper on, let's say, a chest press machine? That's something I done not long ago. Is I manipulated my tempo and added in more range, meaning I went deeper, and it felt a lot better on my chest after doing it than what it was like the previous weeks. So could you increase your range of motion by going like deeper on the movement? Like I said, this can apply to like a squat, a chest press, maybe even a row if you're not going right into the stretch position. So could you increase your range of motion? Typically, when we do so, when we're cutting range short, usually it's when we are not getting to that stretch position on most movements. So if we're, let's say, using more range, typically it will result in a better stimulus for that target muscle, because we build muscle best in that stretch and middle position of a rep. Most research suggests and point towards that, and just from anecdotal experience, really. So could you potentially have more range of motion? Also, as well as that, could you manipulate the tempo, so change how fast you're carrying out the movement? That's what I done, like I just said, on the incline press. So I basically reset it, added more depth in, taking it deeper, and added in a pause at that bottom position. And I'd done the same with my remaining deadlift, actually. And you'll be really surprised, see, adding in a pause. It's like a completely different movement. You pause, and then you'll obviously have to drop weight, which isn't fun. You always want to lift as much as you can if you've, maybe I do anyway. I've got a wee bit of ego in that regard. But adding in the pause and getting better depth felt massively better. And from there, I can then progress those numbers up, and it's like a whole new movement. So again, it's just creating novelty. It's different from what I've not done before. And from there, I'll work those numbers up and get to peak strength doing it with the pause, get as strong as I can with the pause. And then I can maybe go back to it without the pause, or I could maybe change the movement once it stalls with the pause. But for now, I can still stay efficient at performing that movement pattern, because it's not one completely new. That's the benefit of, let's say, just creating a bit of novelty. Is, see, if I'm on the incline, like I've been doing that incline press for a good while, so I'm used to the movement. So if I swap to another movement, it's a completely foreign movement. Whereas adding something like a pause in, it's still a movement I'm pretty used to, but it adds in enough variation so I can progress it. So it makes it still progress, whereas I'm not, let's say, doing a movement I'm not skilled at already. So I'm not having the first few weeks where you're just kind of like adjusting to the exercise, you're not quite used to it. I'm kind of efficient at it and progressing from the get go, from week one. And something you can do is like make an adjustment to the machine if you can, without, let's say, sacrificing good form or sacrificing targeting the muscle effectively. For example, if you are doing a chest press or even a row, if you could adjust the machine if it's adjustable, just by changing the seat height, maybe, if you can do so while still targeting the desired muscle effectively, then you could try and do that, because that makes it, again, slightly new. And you could potentially do like a few of these at the same time. For example, it's like you don't want to change things week on week, whereas if you've been doing a movement, you've realized, right, it's stalled anyway, the seat height could potentially be a bit lower, and I could have a better tempo, then change those two things at the same time, and then you've created a pretty much like a new movement where you've got more runway for progression. So can you make an adjustment to a machine at all? And that you could also consider, like if you are doing, let's say, a squat, could you change your stance? Could you have a different stance where maybe it's slightly narrower? Could you potentially turn your feet out very slightly? Could you potentially on the machine take a different grip, make it slightly wider and narrower if applicable, and if it's not going to sacrifice good execution and being able to target that desired muscle effectively in a pain-free manner? Or could you change the height of like a bench, for example, if you're doing a Smith machine press, or if you are doing like a dumbbell press? Because again, if you're doing like a dumbbell press, you might not have access to a Smith machine. So that's a good example. Could you potentially just change the height of the dumbbell press you're doing? If you're doing like a high incline press, could you put a slightly shallower incline? So could you change something in that regard? And that applies like when you are doing like a row as well. If you're doing like a chest supported row on maybe a bench, you could even change the height of the bench in that regard. And also like rep ranges as well. So rep ranges is something that's going to apply more to some movements than others. For example, if you're doing, let's say, a barbell back squat, you might not want to do 20 to 30 reps. It might not feel great. You might Your lungs might be the limiting factor. However, with, let's say, a leg press, you could probably get away with doing a bit more higher reps because you're in a stable environment where you're already braced because of the seat, so it's not going to be as hard to stabilize yourself. So could you do, let's say, a leg press with a higher rep set? Typically, it's good to do. I like doing leg presses with slightly higher reps. I never really go below 8, and most of the time stay above 10, just because it typically feels better on my joints. Because like the amount of weight you're lifting on a leg press is quite high in comparison to like a squat or any other movement pattern you'll do, or a compound lift for quads. So I typically like staying in quite a high rep range for that reason. So could you potentially change what rep range you're working in on a movement, depending on if it suits exercise? And if it doesn't, then what it'd be like is, right, what about range of motion, tempo, and can they be adjusted potentially? And if so, try and execute them and do that in a better fashion. And with obviously like I said, certain exercises suit certain adjustments more than others. So just always bear that in mind, because you don't want to make the exercise worse in regards to what you're going to get out of it. You want to make it better, or just as effective, but change something so you can progress it again. And something you can also consider is what place has it got in the session. Could you potentially try and move it a bit, let's say, earlier in the session so you can progress it? Especially things where you're like loading your lower back. Could you potentially do like a movement where you're loading your lower back before another? So again, it depends what your session looks like and how you program yourself. But if you're doing, let's say you're doing a lower body session for whatever reason, you're doing a squat and you're doing a deadlift in the same session. Could you try swap them around, see if you can progress both at the same time? Because you might find doing like a squat before or a deadlift before a squat that your lower back's too fatigued, but you might find if you swap them around, you can still progress both for whatever reason. So again, it's not right or wrong. I'm just trying to spark your imagination in regards to what you can do with the order. Or if you're doing like your isolations before your compound movements on a squat, could you potentially swap them about? And could you do like a dead stop variation of a movement? For example, if you're doing a leg press, if you can safely hit the bumpers or the safeties at the bottom, or the leg press can safely bottom out, could you add a dead stop in, slightly pause in that bottom position and then drive up? You could do the same on a chest press, a Smith machine. You could do so on even a rack, because you can have obviously the safeties on the rack, or you can do so on like even a row machine, a ductor. Like you can do that on pretty much every single movement in the gym, bar a squat, unless you put the safeties up. But I'm not sure how great that would feel. So some things that I wouldn't do if you're trying to create novelty is increase your eccentric speed. So typically you'll rarely benefit from having a faster eccentric. So if in doubt, keep it nice and slow in regards to your eccentric, and try and find another form of progression. Because if you're not using, let's say, much eccentric control, then your injury risk is probably going to be higher, especially if you're not pausing the movements at all. Also, could you potentially, or what I wouldn't recommend doing is using momentum. Again, for 99% of movements, using momentum is probably going to make it worse. It's probably going to leave you to stimulating the muscle less, regardless if you're using more weight. So make sure you're not using, make sure you're not using any momentum when you're doing lifts in the gym. And same applies with range of motion. Very, very rarely would less range of motion, or would, less range of motion be better for a muscle group. There's some circumstances where you could potentially argue it might be. For example, if you're doing let's say you're doing a bicep curl and you're curling and then you're moving your upper arm a ton, then that's not maybe targeting your bicep much. Maybe that's not even benefiting from the movement at all. So you could maybe keep your upper arm a bit more still. Same with, let's say, let's think of an example. Maybe like a leg press. Maybe you're getting to the bottom of leg press. You're getting a lot of bend at your knee. Your knee's bent maximally. And then the last thing that moves is your hips. And when your hips are moving, your knee angle doesn't change. So that's just you. That's not you bringing your quad, or that's not you having your knee go through a larger range of motion. That's you simply putting your hips through a larger range of motion, which is not going to benefit your quads. So in some circumstances, more range of motion isn't better. So there's some circumstances where you could reduce range of motion if that's the case. And some others, like if you're doing, let's say, a back movement where you're trying to target a desired muscle, and if, let's say, going in that stretch position ends up your shoulder elevating, when you start rowing again, your shoulder stays elevated, and maybe you don't target your lat effectively because of that, then maybe more range of motion in that circumstance isn't better. But if the range of motion you're using is helping you target the desired muscle effectively, and it's working in terms of it feels good in the target muscle, then I'd rarely recommend reducing the range you're working in. And usually it will result in more fatigue from the movement, meaning more physical and mental tiredness, without much more stimulus, or even worse stimulus from the movement. In other words, a worse stimulus to fatigue ratio. That might not even apply to yourself. If you're new to the gym, then you might not need to really care about that, because you might not be training hard enough, or you might not be training frequently enough, or be strong enough to worry about fatigue accumulation, because the more weight you lift, the more fatigue you'll pretty much accumulate. So if you're really new to the gym, then that won't really apply to yourself. And also, the last thing I'd do is, again, think about the rep range. You don't want to use a rep range and change it, but it results in an injury risk. So if you have, let's say, you're currently having knee issues, then I wouldn't do, let's say, a 5-rep set of squats, because it's new to you, it's foreign, it will add in some novelty. I'd rather you find another form of progression, like adding in a pause would be a better option in that sense, or maybe doing a higher rep set. So you don't want to obviously create novelty just for, or you don't want to get injured just for the sake of creating novelty. So bear that in mind when it comes to the gym. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the episode. So quick recap, it's basically we create novelty to get progressions going again in the gym, and it can help you push the lifts you're concerned about up. So I'm not sure if, in powerlifting as well, like they do that. They kind of like do movements similar to the ones they're trying to progress. For example, it's like you'll see powerlifters potentially do a paused bench. You'll see them potentially do like a paused squat, or like just some variation of a main lift, and that will, as a result, help you progress your main lift. For example, it's like if you do, let's say, in my case, right, I'm doing a paused remaining deadlift after kind of plateauing at 180. I can't remember what it was, 180 something on my normal RDO. So if I work my paused one up and keep progressing it to 180, then if I stop pausing it, then I'm going to well exceed my past personal best on it. Granted, I don't start dieting or my body weight doesn't drop, etc. But I think you get the drift. Like, if you're concerned about doing a movement, although you're moving away from that certain movement for a period of time, although you're not performing that certain movement for a period of time, it can still help you progress that movement in the long term. So don't worry if, let's say, you really want to improve your barbell back squat, but you're using less weight because you're doing paused barbell back squat. So short term, you might be weaker, but long term, you could get more value from it, and it could mean you're stronger as a whole. So hope you enjoyed the episode. Any questions or any episodes you'd like to see, please drop me a message and let me know. If you did enjoy it, share it on your story, like, subscribe, leave a rating and review. Greatly appreciate everyone supporting the podcast and hope everyone has a great rest of their day.